Hi everybody, welcome to Gaffer Gear. Today we're going to do a product review on a light that has become one of my new favourites. It's the Dedolight or Dedolight DLED Turbo 7. Okay, so before we get into the review, I'd like to do an apology to everyone who watches this, who pronounces the name correctly. In Australia we call them Dedolights because that's how it's spelled, D-E-D-O. But I'll be the first Australian to admit that we're pronouncing it incorrectly. It should be pronounced Dedolight because it's named after Dedolight, the guy who invented them. So my apologies for that. The second thing I'd like to say is this is an unpaid review. So everything I say is my honest opinion. The next thing I'd like to say is that I'm a gaffer with 20 years experience and I've actually owned this light for a little bit over a year now. I actually own 6 of them. So I know what the light is truly capable of in a real life working situation. I'm not just believing what the manufacturer says, and I didn't just unbox this a minute ago. So this is a legitimate review. Alright, so in order to review these nice and fast, I'm going to make the assumption that you already know what a Dedo 100 and a Dedo 150 is capable of. In other words, you're already in the industry and you haven't been living under a rock. Alright, so if you're looking at the beam spread on the wall behind me, that's about what you would expect from a Dedo 100 or a Dedo 150. So the first big advantage of these things over the existing technology or over the previous units is that these things flood out to 60 degrees. So these outflood a Fresnel. However, they still have what you'd expect from a Dedo. They still spot all the way down to 4 degrees. The other thing that's really cool about these, if you've got the bi-color versions, if you're buying the bi-color, is that you can adjust your color temp. So the range is 2,800 on the dial up to, I think it's 6,800. Let's have a look. Let's have a look. All the way up to, yep, 6,800. Now that's what it says on the dial. It actually goes to 7,100, but we'll talk about that later. And the other thing that's fantastic with these units is they are dimmable with minimal color shift. So as I dim it down, if that was a tungsten light, it would be going amber. So that works. That's a really big advantage with the units. One of the other advantages you have with this system over the old tungsten units is you can run the whole system off battery if you elect to go with the battery ballasts. Now the Dedo 100s and Dedo 150s, they were a straight 12 volt globe, so you could hook them up to a battery. However, the controller was also the AC power adapter, so you couldn't run them off battery with a controller. Whereas with this system, you've got full functionality of the controls because the whole system runs off battery. Now I run the system off battery quite a bit. I use it as a satellite system on set. I have a battery attached to the stand, using that also as a shot bag. But look, it allows me to move the units around the set without having to take the time to have a cable run and follow me around all the time. The other thing too is running off the V-Lock batteries, my high capacity batteries, I get over 2 hours runtime. Okay, so for this part of the review I've turned the overhead light off just to show you the barn door cuts. So these units have the same barn door cuts and the same sharpness of optics that the tungsten Dedos had. I actually found in comparison, when I compared them directly, that the LEDs were a little bit sharper. The only criticism I have of the barn door cuts is that the light now goes wider than the old traditional Dedos did, but they haven't made any adjustments to the width on the barn doors. So if you're trying to cut the entire beam, you will need to extend your barn doors a little bit. Now another massive advantage these have over the old tungsten units is when you're using the projectors. Now if you owned a set of projectors or with your tungsten units, you know when you put them on you got to spot up a little bit. Well, on these LED units, because the flood spot range is different, the sweet spot optically for the projector is all the way back down towards the spot side of things. So what that means is you've got a massive amount of light in your projection chamber. So just before I turn this on, I'd like to point out that in the room here I have a 2000 watt Blondie, 2000 watt floodlight bounced off the roof, and I'm lit with an LED panel. So there's quite a bit of ambient light in here. Now with the Dedo 150s with a projector, you had to be really close to your subject matter because you didn't get much light out of it. But have a look at this. So this is in a room, again, 2000 watts bouncing off the roof, and we've got a 100 watt LED panel lighting me up. So very, very powerful. Here's some photographs and some footage that I took last night using the projector. So that's a handy little thing. The projector comes in really, really handy now. One of the other advantages the LED light has with the projector mount is its greater flood spot range. So you can create a hot spot in the center and have the rest of your gobo patterns graduate off. Very quickly, for those of you who are not familiar with the projection mount, you can defocus your gobo patterns. Alright, so that's all the advantages. Now let's get into some stats. So these are all things that I've metered, so these aren't things that I found online. I've actually run a spectrometer over these units. So the lowest TCL score I could find anywhere in the range was 95.4. The highest TCL score I came across was 97.7. Now, for those of you who know me and watch my channel, you will know that I don't put much weight on CRI or TCL scores. My preferred reference system is TM30 color vector testing, and on TM30 color vector testing these things score really well in warm white or in tungsten. They score 93.3. Color vector test is, it takes 99 readings, roughly 3-degree spacings on the color vector, so it gives you a much better indication of what the light's doing overall. So these scored in tungsten 93.3. And in daylight they scored 90.6. Now, to give you some idea, a really, really good score is 94. So the best LED light I've come across so far this year had a score of 94. Some lights that I've got that everybody really loves and everybody really likes only score about 89. And to give you another further idea, a small HMI would only score about, say, 92. Okay, so let's talk about the brightness. Well, in warm white or tungsten, these I equate these to a 300 watt Fresnel. They're actually 2% off a 300 watt Fresnel. So that's what I equate them to in tungsten. In daylight, I've compared them to HMI Fresnels. So matching up a HMI Fresnel to matching beam angles on these, I would rate these as a 160 watt HMI equivalent. So for a 90 watt LED engine, that's not a lot of light coming out of it. However, for the size of the unit, that is quite a bit of kick. Yeah, so 160 watt HMI equivalent. Now, I'd just like to say something. If you're looking at buying one of these, you've probably done a bit of research, and you constantly hear that these things are 90 watt, 90 watt. It's got two 90 watt LED arrays in it. It's 90 watt. It is not 90 watt. Okay, you've got a cooling fan and you've got the controller box as well. So as a system, it actually draws 105 watts, and that's very, very important to note when it comes to buying a transformer. Okay, so next up we're going to talk about the calibration. So what do I mean by calibration? Well, calibration refers to when you dial in a color temperature, for example. Is that what actually comes out of the light? Now, I'll just start off by saying that if this was a 1x1 LED panel, I would not be happy with the calibration on it. I would expect better, so I wouldn't buy it. But that's a bit of an unfair comparison, because manufacturers of a 1x1 LED panel have the luxury of having enough room in the panel that they can separate the diodes enough that they don't interfere with each other. They can separate the phosphor mixers enough that they don't interfere with each other. This unit here, oh, by the way, a 1x1 panel typically has two 50 watt LED arrays in it. This unit here has two 90 watt LED arrays crammed into a space less than an inch. So basically this is on the cutting edge of what LED physics can do, and that's why the calibration's not as great as you'd expect it to be if it was, say, a 1x1 panel. And you just have to suck that up if you're buying one, because They literally hit a physics hurdle. They can't get it any better. Now, in terms of the problems they hit, talking to LED manufacturers on forums and talking to LED manufacturers I know, when we're talking about what Dedo was trying to do, a lot of the LED manufacturers said it was actually impossible and they'd never get it to happen. So bear that in mind when we talk about the calibration. So in order to make the calibration a bit easy to understand, I've split it into multiple sections. So I've split it into warm white, so that's 4,000 degrees Kelvin and below, warm white. Neutral white, which is 4,000 to 5,000 degrees Kelvin, and cool white, which is anything above 5,000 degrees Kelvin. Now I also took my readings at different percentages on the dimmers. So I took it at 100%, I took the readings at 50%, and then I took the readings at 10%. Now at 100%, the unit actually performs relatively well, it's quite good. So in your warm whites, that's anything below 4,000 degrees Kelvin, it has an accuracy of about 50 degrees Kelvin. So, and it usually, the colour's usually up on what you've dialed in. The worst I came across was 77 degrees Kelvin out, but typically about 30 degrees Kelvin, so averaged out to about 50 degree Kelvin accuracy in your warm whites. In your neutral whites, you're looking at about 100 degree Kelvin accuracy, and it always read over. Now, I just like to say, sometimes I got readings of like 103 degrees Kelvin out, and quite a few readings, it was only out by about 4 degrees Kelvin, literally 4 single degrees Kelvin. So, not too bad. Now, in cool whites, so your daylights, the unit can be out by 200 to 300 degrees Kelvin on average. So what I actually found, to get 5,600 degrees Kelvin, if you're trying to be really clinical, you want to dial in 5,400 degrees Kelvin. Okay, now with the dimmer at 50%, your warm white and neutral whites are pretty much the same. They vary a bit from being at 100%, but they're about the same amount of accuracy. However, your cool whites tend to be out by 500 degrees Kelvin on average, or around 500 degrees Kelvin, and they tend to read over. So what I found with running my spectrometer over it is, if you wanted to get 5,600 degrees Kelvin on the money, you actually need to dial in 5,300 on the controller. Now, when you set the dimmer to 10%, that's when you notice the problems that they've had trying to calibrate the unit. They must be getting a lot of noise from between the two channels when everything's compacted that much into such a small array. So warm white, you're looking at an accuracy of about 250 to 300 degrees Kelvin. So with one exception, if you're right down the bottom end of the scale, that reads correctly. But if you're close to, say, 4,000 degrees Kelvin, you're looking at an accuracy of between 250 to 300 degrees Kelvin out, and it always reads under. Now, in your neutral whites, 4,000 to 5,000 degrees Kelvin, I found that it tends to read 250 degrees Kelvin over. And in your daylights, your 5,000 degrees Kelvin and up, seriously, don't even bother reading the display. Set it by eye or by meter only. Now, one thing I forgot to mention is in warm white, the unit has a bit of magenta in it. So it's about a 1/6 correction gel out. So a lot of you are going, hey, no one makes a 1/6. So if you want to get really fussy and you're trying to match to tungsten perfectly, you'd want to put a 1/8 green gel, a 1/8 plus green gel on the light. But in all seriousness, with that, that sort of pink in warm white is the new warm white. Every single bicolor light I've tested in the last 2 years is pretty much the same. The only lights that don't do that are RGBW, where they must dial in a bit of green on the green channel to neutralize the pink out. Even LED downlights, everything, that seems to be the new norm. But it looks great on skin tones, and look, I've been using these lights and the other lights that also are the same for well over a year now, and nobody's noticed. Alright, so let's talk about the negatives, the things I don't like. One problem you have with these is you're constantly adjusting the tension here with a spanner. So I asked Dedo why they didn't put a lock-off on. They gave me a really interesting reply. First off, the problem is when you're running a head lead, the head lead comes out the back a little bit, So any sort of tension on that head lead and the thing starts tilting. So if you're running one of these, put the head lead back underneath so it doesn't tilt. But Dido gave me an interesting explanation as to why they discontinued the idea of the lock-off. And they said the problem is cinematographers don't use lock-offs. When they come to adjust a light, they don't come over, undo the lock-off, then make their little adjustment, then do the lock-off. No, they just come along and force it. And I've got to say, 20 years of being a gaffer, that is absolutely on the money. The amount of lock-offs I've had to replace with strip threads, I've lost track of. So that was an interesting, point that they made. But yeah, so that's one thing to be aware of is if you buy them, you're going to be constantly, make sure you've got a little spanner or at least a Leatherman tool so that you can adjust the tension. The next thing is in relation to the head leads. Dado is a very humble guy. He'll make a light like this and he won't announce it to the world. No, he'll have the worst internet presence you've ever come across. You cannot find part numbers or anything for this. You go to official Dado websites, this has been out for a year, it doesn't exist. The only website I've come across for Dado product that seems to be up to date is Lemac Australia. Everyone else's website's absolute rubbish. But yeah, talking about head leads, you want a head lead, good luck finding a part number. You can't even order them. So you end up making your own because there's just nothing, there's no information out there on the net. But here's something to point out. See how the inside of the Canon plug here, it's white or grey? That means that it's non-standard. So that means that the pins are out of alignment to the keyway. So what that's for is so that the audio department doesn't plug one of their cables into your power supply and blow up their sound card. If they go to plug in, it won't connect. So that's worth pointing out that you need non-standard. Otherwise you'll make the same mistake I did. You'll buy a whole stack of leads and a whole stack of ends and the system won't work. Now I'll get into what is really my only real criticism of the Dado system, and that is their logic towards controllers and transformers. So if you want to buy one of these systems, you've got a choice of 4 ballasts. You've got 2 AC ballasts that plug into your power outlets, and you've got 2 DC ballast options that you can run off battery. So your AC ballast options are DMX and non-DMX, and your battery options are DTAP or 4-pin XLR. So here's the problem with that logic. If you want to run off mains power only, that's great. If you want to run off battery only, that logic's great. But if you want to run off both, if you want to have the option to run batteries one day and the next day you want to run off mains power, it's not really an option there. The solution they've told me is to buy both. Well, I can't afford to do that. So the only real solution, if you can only afford one ballast, is to buy the DC ballast option, the battery ballast option, because at the very least then you can plug a transformer in and run it off a domestic power outlet. So here's my criticism of if you go that way, if you want to run batteries and mains. You've got a lot of bits and pieces to keep track of. So I just want to show you how many bits and pieces there are to deal with. So let's imagine we're going to use the light and we're going to put it up high on a stand. Well, you'd want to have a head lead so that you've got your transformer and your ballast down low. So that's no problem. That's pretty stock standard these days. So at the moment we've got the head and we've got a head lead. The head lead of course plugs into your ballast. Okay, so this is my DC ballast. Head lead plugs into that. So okay, at this stage there's nothing complex. Okay, we've got a head lead, a ballast and a head. So pretty manageable. Now with the battery ballast you get a choice of either a DTAP connector or an XLR. Now I went with XLR because if I'm plugging in a transformer I want a decent connection that's not going to disconnect, and I think XLR would be better for that than having DTAP. However, what that means for me is if I want to run this off a battery, there is no battery terminal, no battery connection on this unit. It doesn't have a battery mount. So if I want to run this off a V-Lock battery, I have to plug in a XLR to DTAP adapter. So that's another piece of hardware I have to keep track of. Now if I want to run this off mains, I now have to plug it into a transformer. Okay, now the transformers are all international, which means I now have to plug this into an IEC lead, which then plugs into my domestic power outlet. So as you can see, there's a lot of bits and pieces here. So the main problem with this is if you get a bad connection anywhere in the system, it can take you about a minute to find it because there's just too many bits and pieces. Okay, well to sum up, this is my new favourite light. I've got 6 of these. I love them. They just do stuff that no other LED can do. So color tunable, well, a lot of LEDs can do that. Dimmable, a lot of LEDs can do that. But you know, the field of light, you know, in flood, perfectly consistent shadows right across the beam. The exposure is even right across the beam. There's hardly any lights in the industry that can do that, and pretty much nothing in LED. Optical control, flood to spot, 20:1 flood to spot ratio, 20:1. Put the projector on the front, and you can project a go both. So that's being projected from 5 meters away in a room that's got a blondie bounced off the roof. So these do a heck of a lot, and they're extremely well built. I mean, this thing is solid as a rock. It'll outlive me. But here's the big negative. So if you're looking to buy one of these, you've probably looked at the review and gone, wow, these lights are impressive. $3,000 price tag. That's roughly what it'll cost you in Aussie dollars for one of these. 3,000 bucks. It's probably way out of reach. But for me, the $3,000 is worth it, because as a tool, it is a very, very finely crafted tool and a very, very accurate tool to use. If you can't afford one, well, you've seen the review, you know what they can do. They are available to rent from me. I love them. I've had a love affair with Dedolights for quite some time. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the review, and I'll catch you on set sometime. And just to finish off, for those of you who are not familiar with Dedos, I've gone through my archives, and here's some photos of them in use over the last 16 years that my archives go back.